So I'll start by kind of defining what we mean when we talk about mental health problems or psychological distress. You'll have heard the kind of diagnoses or these kind of labels of anxiety, depression, and kind of more scary terms like schizophrenia and personality disorders, and all these things that are used in the media and stuff and in common language. But in reality, what all of those things are just different forms of distress presented in different ways. Which is, so people not eating, people not sleeping, find it difficult to kind of get up, go out, go to work, function in the day-to-day life that they're supposed to within this society. So, like I said, I'm going to talk about what the kind of dominant narratives are about mental health in society today. So they're considered to be this kind of, like I said, these illnesses, these kind of labels and illnesses are used to explain distress. And it's, in the past it was talked about as solely being caused by something that's wrong in your brain, a chemical imbalance, but more recently it's been acknowledged that it's a chemical imbalance that interacts with the environment, but it's still very much a heavy weight of it is on it being a kind of illness that's caused by problems in the brain. And it's also kind of classed in these terms of like disorders, which is quite an interesting use of a term, a mental disorder in a lot of ways, which is, it's kind of gone out of fashion that, but certainly was used until relatively recently. It's almost like that disorder is not ordered, not functioning in the way that we expect you to function. You're somehow resisting that. Now, I think recently, I'm kind of going to talk a bit about how mental health is seen under neoliberalism kind of interweave with this. So whereas before it was seen as like a disorder, something was very, very wrong with people, lock them all away, kind of sedate them and just kind of leave them there. More recently, the dominant narratives have kind of shifted to being, well, yeah, there's some people that we just need to lock away and sedate, but there's other people who, yours aren't so bad. If you try hard enough, if you use enough willpower, you can get over and you get better, and most importantly, you can go back to work. So that's been a bit of a shift, and that's where the therapists have come in. Where now you can talk to therapists, and they can help you figure out what's wrong with you. You can change your thinking a bit, and then get back to being an ordered member of society who gets along with daily life as we expect you to. And if anybody read that article I posted about magical volunteerism, or if anyone's read that, you'll that links into that. I can talk about that more when I come back or in the discussion if people want me to. But it's this kind of idea that if you hope for something, if you wish for something, then you can make it happen no matter what the other circumstances are that's going on. But one of the other dominant narratives is that unusual experiences, things like hearing voices or having hallucinations, are always part of an illness. This is something bad and dangerous that you shouldn't have and you should hide away. And rather than thinking that it's something that's part of normal human experience. And one of the other narratives is kind of, so you've got, mental illnesses, but then they're seen as quite different from other forms of what I would consider to be distress, but aren't seen as that by the system. So like social problems of drinking, using drugs, violence, conflict with others, they're seen as they're social problems. That's different to the mental illnesses. We'll help the mental illnesses, but the social problems, you just need to be better people. So it's kind of that's how services are kind of set up. So they're kind of the dominant narratives around how psychological distress is seen in society currently. And they're the dominant narratives. They're not the only narratives, so there are service user movements that have shifted some of those things slightly. Many psychologists see things differently to that. They acknowledge environment and social causes much more. But they're still the way services and support and everything to help people with distress is set up in that way. So, what's the evidence against it? What's the argument against it? The whole system of diagnoses of mental health problems and labels has been really heavily criticised as being not valid, not reliable at all. So if you've got somebody in here now who is really distressed, you've got 10 psychiatrists in the room, they'd probably give them all different diagnoses. And if you look at any person who's been getting support from services for a long time, it's very rare that they would have 1 or 2 diagnoses. They've probably got 6, 7, which and a medication to go along with each one. So the kind of whole system of having medical diagnoses is it's not reliable. You know, if you're interested in looking up, let's see Richard Bentall or Joanne Moncrieff, they talk a lot about why it's so sort of just not reliable. And there's also heaps of evidence that talks about the social causes of mental health, of psychological distress and mental health problems. Some really interesting work by a guy called Eric Emerson, who has looked at social inequalities and how actually when you look at basically in societies where there is a greater gap between rich and poor, there are many more mental health problems diagnosed. Similarly, if you look at kind of poorer social classes, there's much like there's more mental health problems, more people experience more distress. And that's not to say that it's just the experience of not having enough money that somehow makes you ill, but it's the impact of that on so many different areas. So living in poor housing conditions, having poor nutrition, the pressure that puts on relationships and then how people interact, the exposure to crime, and feelings of powerlessness that accompany that, disrespect from others, a lack of control, all those things. And there's a lot of evidence out there to suggest that's the case. And these ideas aren't new. You know, the anti-psychiatry movement put these forward. People like Thomas Saz, have all talked about that. The idea of health inequalities, or inequalities in terms of money having an impact on mental health, has been around for like decades. It's just not new research, but it's really, really kind of squashed down. Let's not pay any attention to it. And the reason for that, obviously, is if that came to light, then the implications of it, well, don't medicate, let's change the society. If it's making people that sick, then we need to, you know, change society. Even if whether you think reformism or change the system, it has implications for the social surroundings rather than just being able to give a medication. And then obviously it also does not suit the pharmaceutical companies who make mega bucks off mental health drugs, basically. So then, how could Marxism or Marxist theory kind of explain psychological distress? How could it kind of add to, you know, what's out there in terms of knowing that it's social causes that really contribute? There's two concepts, I think, in Marxist theory that help to understand psychological distress, and that's alienation and oppression. So, alienation, I am just going to read this from a thing because I find it hard to get my head around myself. So, workers are alienated from the products of the labour and they don't control them. So, in a manufacturing plant, someone will make one little bit of a car. They don't create the whole car and then go and drive it even, they just make one tiny little part and they don't see it joined up, so they don't get that kind of, they don't see the full process, so they become alienated from not only the things that they're creating in their work, but also from the activity itself, and through all that, they become alienated from nature, from their own brain, from you know, like your own sort of life activity, from human life. That's a really whistle-stop tour of alienation in Marxist terms. So then that leads to kind of powerlessness and an experience of an inhuman existence, which then subsequently leads to distress. And I think that makes a lot of sense in terms of my clinical experience. When you think about when I've been working with people, the most effective clinical change has been made not just through me working with a person, but through when they make connections with nature or with other people, and it somehow kind of cracks through that a little bit, cracks through that alienation a little bit. And the other aspect is oppression. So, and this is an area that I think really can be expanded on. So, oppression, there are lots of different forms of oppression. So, racism, sexism, homophobia. And they all serve to kind of reinforce the interests of capitalism. So racism was kind of created to justify the slave trade and imperialism, and perpetuated by the need to keep workers divided. Towards the end of the 19th century, kind of homosexuality was invented and portrayed as kind of a threat to society and the maintenance of the family. And you can consider the same thing with this kind of idea of psychological distress or mental health problems. If you had a look about where, like when, if anyone's ever heard of something called the DSM, it's the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, which is the American sort of, you know, the Wikipedia of all the different mental health diagnoses you can have. And then we've got one in the UK as well that's called the ICD. But if you look at when the DSM was first invented, it was invented in 1952. So that's when mental illnesses basically got created. Before that, there were kind of like 5 or 6 terms that people kind of used to explain when people were really kind of sort of psychotic or, you know, really kind of distant from reality, which in a really intense distressed states. Yeah, so it was actually it was introduced after World War II and after a lot of involvement from the veterans, kind of saying, look, all this distress is out there, and it's almost like, in some ways, I think it was created to justify the really, really sick parts of capitalism that you see in war. It was almost, you know, to justify that it's okay for people to be this distressed because it's something wrong with their brain. So it shifts the blame away from being on the what an awful thing war is, how it just doesn't need to happen in that way, and onto actually it's just, you know, we just need to give them medication and lock them away. It's kind of shifted even further under neoliberalism, because now so initially it justified war, but more recently it justifies a schedule of working that's just really, really unnatural for people and puts people under really horrible forms of distress, which is where it kind of links back to alienation. It kind of justifies the entire system in a lot of ways. Which this is only something I've been thinking through the past week, and I don't think it's a novel idea. I expect people have thought about it and written about it before, but I haven't come across it, so I can't remember if I have come across it. I could just be completely plagiarising and forgotten it, but yes, I think that the idea of mental health labels and mental health difficulties as illnesses is a form of oppression. Once you it's set up in this similar ways to racism and sexism in a lot of ways, and it divides because people are really scared of people with mental health problems, because the stigma and this, you know, kind of fear that someone with schizophrenia has got a knife and they're going to get you in the street, and all this stuff, which is, you know, really, really just so unlikely to happen. People are much more likely to kill themselves and hurt anybody else, and when they do, it's more likely to be someone they're close to rather than a stranger. Okay, I'm going off on tangents. So, you can draw distinctions between the way distress is medicalised in the same way that sexism and racism are. So the kind of the medicalisation excuse was used in racism. You know, different, and it still is used. It's still around, that kind of myth that somehow people are different in their brains when they're a different colour. And the same with sexism, you know, that people are wired differently and that's why they behave a certain way, rather than, so it's the same kind of, it's the same debate, it's the same kind of excuse really. And in the same way with racism and sexism, people who experience mental health problems experience it different depending on their material position. Someone who has, I don't know, a qualified doctor who then becomes ill is in a better position to argue their case within the system and all this kind of stuff, or a solicitor who gets ill is in a much better place to argue for better rights and things within the system than someone who's lived in a council estate all their life, had really poor access to education. Okay. So, just to conclude then, I think the Marxist theories of alienation and repression can contribute to our understanding, but I think at the moment the the role of oppression can be, or how we apply kind of the theory of oppression to mental health can be really expanded. And I think comparing and contrasting it to kind of racism and sexism and disablism provides a framework to kind of think about that with. But as I say, this is only something I've been thinking over the past week, so I'll be interested to see how other people think that kind of fits in. And because I think it's really important, I'm not kind of going down the avenue of we need to understand each different form of oppression and just tackle it on its own, because I think we need to change the system, not just, not just go for gains within the system. But I think if we don't properly understand this as a form of oppression, then we're limited in how we can know how to make gains in the area, or how we can kind of intervene, or even talk to people in terms of like the activity they're making, trying to fight against